Rocky Mountains, early 1800s. The wind changed before the snow came. Elias Crowe noticed it the way a man notices age in his own hands. Not all at once, but with quiet certainty that something irreversible had begun. The air that afternoon carried no flakes, no visible warning. The sky remained pale, indifferent gray, but the cold sharpened, thinning the breath, hardening every sound. Even the mountains seemed to draw inward as if bracing themselves. Elias stood just beyond the edge of his cabin clearing, his coat pulled tight, his boots half buried in crusted earth that had not yet frozen solid. He did not look at the cabin first. He looked past it, toward the horses. Six of them stood near the tree line, heads low, tails angled slightly into the wind. They were calm but alert. Experienced animals, rocky stock. They felt the change. Elias had learned long ago that winter did not arrive with drama. It arrived with stillness. Men new to the mountains waited for snowfall. Elias waited for silence. The birds had vanished by midday. By dusk, even the wind through the pines sounded wrong. Shorter gusts, heavier pauses between them. The kind of wind that didn't wonder, the kind that gathered itself. He walked slowly toward the horses, boots crunching softly. No rush. Rush man missed details. Details were the only things that kept you alive this far west. One of the mares lifted her head and watched him approach. Frost clung lightly to her whiskers already, though the sun had not yet set. Elias reached out and ran a gloved hand along her neck. The winter coat was thick, dense, full, good. She was ready, but readiness was not the same as safety. Elias scanned the horizon to the northwest. The clouds that sat lower, darker, not moving fast, but moving with purpose. He had seen this pattern before. Twice it had nearly killed him. Once it had cost him horse. That winter had been years earlier when he still believed good fire and tight cabin could solve most problems. He remembered the sound of that horse collapsing in the night. Not scream, not panic, just dull final thud in the dark. By morning, the animal was stiff, frozen where it had stood. Didn't kill it. Wet cold did. Wind did. Standing still did. Elias exhaled slowly, watching the breath fade. He had no clock, but his body told him what time it was. The storm would arrive by morning, maybe sooner. He turned in slow circle, measuring the land the way carpenter measured wood, the slope behind the cabin, the line of scrub trees, the shallow dip where snow would drift and pile. He wasn't thinking in words. He was thinking in shapes and forces. Wind, weight, warmth lost. The horses shifted closer together without being driven. That too was sign. Elias rested, his hands on his hips, and stood still for a moment longer. In the early years, he might have panicked, might have tried to rush the horses inside, seal them up, fight the storm head on. But experience had carved something steadier into him. In the Rockies, winter didn't kill men first. It killed horses, and when the horses were gone, men followed. He turned back toward the cabin only long enough to retrieve what he needed. Rope, tools, handful of iron spikes worn smooth with age. No lantern yet. It was still light, and light meant time. As he walked back toward the open ground beyond the tree line, the wind pressed harder against his shoulder as if urging him to hurry. Elias did not hurry, but he did not hesitate either. There was work to be done before the snow fell, not to fight the storm, but to prepare for it. Mobility was survival in the early Rockies. In the early years of the Rocky Mountain frontier, a man could endure hunger longer than he could endure stillness. Elias Crowe knew this well. He had gone hungry before, days at a time, weeks once. Hunger made a man thin, irritable, slow, but it did not trap him. Losing horse did. Out here, horse was not livestock. It was distance. It was time. It was the thin margin between escape and being buried where you stood with horse. Elias could ride 30 miles and they reach lower ground, find game pushed down soaked by weather, haul fire up without breaking his back. Without one, every task shrank the world. What had been valley became prison. Men new to the mountains spoke of horses the way farmers spoke of tools, replaceable, useful, something traded or risked. Elias had learned better, slowly and at cost. Years earlier, before the mountains had finished teaching him, he had owned 8 horses going into winter, strong animals, good stock. He believed tight cabin and big woodpile were enough. He believed the horses would manage on their own for a few nights of bad weather. They didn't. The storm that winter came fast and wet. Snow turned to sleet, sleet to freezing rain. Wind pressed moisture deep into animals' coats. By the second night, one of the geldings stopped moving. Elias found it at dawn, legs locked, eyes clouded, body frozen in shallow drift. That horse had its star. It hadn't been injured. It had simply lost the ability to stay warm. By spring, Elias had lost 3 more, not all at once. One weakened then another. Each loss made the remaining work heavier, slower, more dangerous. He survived that winter, but only barely. From then on, Elias never counted winter supplies without counting horses first. Because horses didn't just carry men, they carried options. When storms closed mountain passes, horse meant you could move before the worst arrived. When snowberry gained trails, horse meant you could follow rivers farther than your legs would allow. When sickness came, or injury, or simple exhaustion, horse meant you could leave, man on foot. Winter was man negotiating with death every mile. That was why Elias had turned toward the horses before the cabin. When the wind shifted, the cabin could wait. What could be split later? Man could sleep cold for a night or two and recover. Horse could not. Horses burned energy faster and cold than men did. Their size worked against them. Long legs lost heat. Large lungs pulled in freezing air, and unlike men, they could not explain pain or plan ahead or decide, conserve strength. They only followed instinct, and instinct did not always favor survival in landscape this unforgiving. Elias walked the line of trees slowly, watching how the horses stood. Their posture told him more than any weather sign. Heads low, but not drooping, weight shifting from hoof to hoof, tails angled into the wind, still alert. Good signs for now, but Elias knew better than to trust. Or for now, when the Rockies, winter did not arrive to test comfort. It arrived to remove mistakes. Every man who lasted long enough learned the same rule, whether he admitted it or not. You could rebuild cabin, you could replace tools. You could even survive an empty pantry for time. But if winter took your horses, it would soon come back for you. That understanding settled heavily in Elias's chest as he measured the land again, already thinking ahead. Not about warmth for himself, but about how to keep 6 living engines of muscle and breath from freezing in place before morning. The storm was coming, and this time he intended to be ready. While cold alone rarely killed a horse by nightfall, the temperature had dropped, but not enough to worry Elias Crowe. Not yet. Cold by itself was something horses had endured for thousands of winters. Their bodies were built for it. Thick winter coats trapped pockets of air close to the skin. Strong circulation kept blood moving to the core. As long as they could stay dry and keep moving, a horse could withstand cold that would cripple a man. What Elias watched was not the thermometer. He watched the wind. Wind was invisible, but it carried intent. It searched for openings between hairs, beneath saddles, through muscle and bone. When wind reached the skin, it stripped away the thin layer of warmth the body worked constantly to produce. Each gust pulled heat outward faster than the animal could replace it. And when wind brought moisture with it, the danger multiplied. Moisture collapsed the insulating structure of winter coat. Snow that melted against warm skin seeped inward. Freezing rain worked its way down to the hide. Once wet, the trapped air that kept horse warm was gone. Heat drained steadily, silently. Elias had seen it happen too many times to doubt it. Horse could stand in dry, bitter cold, survive the night, but let that same horse stand in stiff wind with damp hair, and it will begin to fail. Slowly at first, then all at once, he moved closer to the herd and watched their breathing. Each exhale rose in thick white plume before vanishing into the dark. The rhythm was steady, good. Fast breathing meant stress, and stress burned energy. One of the younger horses shifted its weight and stamped hoof. Elias noted where the snow had already begun to soften beneath it. Ground that stayed wet after dark would freeze hard by morning. Hard ground stole heat faster than air ever could. Moisture came from below as much as from the sky. Men who didn't understand this tried to fight cold with walls and fire. They sealed animals inside tight barns, thinking still air meant warmth. But Elias had learned what happened inside those spaces. Breath collected, steam rose, condensation crept down rough timbers and dripped onto backs and flanks. Straw turned damp beneath hooves, the barn stayed quiet, and the horses grew weaker. Warmth without dryness was light. Elias crouched and scooped a handful of soil, squeezing it between his fingers. It broke apart cleanly. Still dry, he let it fall and brushed his hands against his coat. The ground would hold for now, but not for long. He straightened and turned his face into the wind. It came sharp and steady from the northwest, cutting through the trees with wondering. That told him everything he needed to know. This would not be drifting snowstorm that buried the land solely. This would be driving wind, one that forced cold into every opening and punished anything left exposed. Elias glanced at the horses again. They had begun to angle themselves instinctively, turning their backs to the wind, standing closer together. Animals understood wind better than men did, but instinct alone would not be enough. Wind did not need much time to do its work. Once horse began to lose heat, its muscles stiffened, movement slowed, blood retreated from the legs to protect the core. The animal stood still. Not because it wanted to, but because it could no longer do otherwise. And once horse stopped moving in winter, the end followed quietly. Elias exhaled and reached for the rope coiled at his side. He would not wait for snow to make the danger visible. By then, it would already be too late. Cold did not kill horses. Wind and moisture did. And if he was going to keep this herd alive through the night, he would have to deal with both before darkness fully settled over the mountains. Why Elias refused to lock the horses inside, the first instinct of a frightened man is to close things in. Walls feel like safety, doors feel like control, and when winter presses hard against the land, the idea of sealing animals inside a solid structure seems not only logical but necessary. Elias Crowe had learned slowly and painfully that this instinct was wrong. He had built barns before. Tight ones, thick lub walls chinked with clay, small doors to keep heat in, low roofs meant to trap warmth. On paper, they made sense. In practice, they failed horses quietly. Standing at the edge of the clearing, Elias looked past the cabin toward the open ground beyond the trees. He could have driven the horses inside. He had rope enough, space enough, but he did not move to do it. Sealed barn did not stop cold, they transformed it. Inside an enclosed space, horse breathed out warmth and moisture with every exhale. 6 horses meant 12 lungs pulling
Okay,
freezing air and
gust of
pushing
light
damp
with
air
wind
out. Within minutes, the
snapping
air
through
grew
trees.
heavy. Steam
You
rose
see
from
how
flanks and
sheltered the
backs.
walls
Frost formed on
was.
rafters, then softened and dripped as temperature shifted. The horses stood still, pressed together, their winter coats slowly losing the very structure meant to protect them. Wet hair flattened, trapped air vanished. What remained was animals standing in cold, damp darkness, unable to move freely, burning energy just to remain upright. Elias had seen that before, subtle at first. Horse that refused feed, one that shifted its weight too often, another that would not lie down, not because it was alert, but because it no longer trusted its legs to rise again. By morning, the damage was done. Warmth that could not escape turned against the animal. Moisture lingered. Cold crept in through the floor, through the walls, through the breath itself. Shelter, Elias had learned, was not about heat. It was about control. Control of wind, control of moisture, control of movement. He stepped away from the cabin and walked the perimeter of the open ground, boots crunching softly. He traced the line of the trees with his eyes, noting where they broke and where they thickened. A shelter that blocked all air was a trap. A shelter that shaped air. Protection. This was why mountain men spoke less of barns and more of placement. Where you stood mattered as much as what you built. A slight rise in the lane could deflect wind, a line of brush could slow it, a curve could turn it away without stopping it entirely. Elias stopped near, a shallow dip where snow would naturally gather. He shook his head. Drifts formed pressure. Pressure crushed warmth. He moved again, settling his gaze on a patch of ground backed by timber on one side and open just enough on the other. The wind struck here at an angle, not head on. It would lose strength before reaching anything standing behind it. This was the place. He drove a boot heel into the soil, marking the line in his mind. The horses would not be sealed away from the storm. They would stand within it, protected but breathing freely. Many men believed survival meant building stronger walls. Elias knew better. In winter, strength came from knowing what to through and what to stop. And as the light faded and the wind stiffened, he reached for his tools, ready to shake the land just enough to keep the cold from taking what it always reached for first. How Elias shaped the wind
This
instead of
shelter
fighting
was
it.
not
Elias
built to
Crowe did
stop
not
mountain
build
men
against the
from
storm.
weakening
He
the
built for
walls that kept
survival.
it,
By the
but it
time the
kept
last
it
light
without
slipped
force.
behind the ridge, the wind had settled into a steady push from the northwest. It no longer shifted or wandered. It pressed forward with purpose, cold and deliberate, as if testing the land for weakness. Elias took that direction and made it his guide. He worked without hurry, but without pause. Years in the mountains had taught him that panic wasted energy, and wasted energy led to mistakes. He gathered what the land already offered. Fallen poles from the tree line, rough planks salvaged from an older corral, bundles of dry prairie grass stacked since autumn. Nothing new, nothing refined. Frontier shelters were not about craftsmanship, they were about function under pressure. He began by setting the first posts low and wide, driving them into the frozen soil at slight angles. Walls caught the wind and failed. Angled ones bled its strength away. The line curved gently, not in hard arc, but in long, shallow sweep. Like the inside of bent hand shielding flame, the back of the structure faced the wind. The open side faced south and east, where weaker air would drift rather than strike. Elias lashed poles together with rope worn soft by years of use. He stacked prairie grass thickly along the lower sections where wind traveled fastest and cold worked hardest. Higher up, caps were left loose. Air would move, but it would move slowly. That was the balance. Stop the wind too completely, and moisture gathered. Let it rush through unchecked, and warmth vanished. As the shelter took shape, the horses watched him. They had learned his movements, learned what his calm meant. One by one, they drifted closer, standing just behind the growing curve, testing the space with their bodies. Even before the shelter was finished, the difference was noticeable. The wind still moved, but it no longer cut. Snow carried on the air began to drop before reaching the ground behind the barrier. Elias stepped into the hollow and felt it immediately. The pressure eased, sound softened, the air held still just long enough to matter. He adjusted the lower edge, adding more grass where the ground dipped. Wind always found the ground first. If he stopped it there, the rest followed. By full dark, the structure stood no higher than a man's chest at its tallest point. It would have looked unimpressive to anyone expecting barn or stable, but Elias knew better. This was not building. It was zone, place where when lost its authority, the horses moved into it fully now, turning their backs to the storm without being driven. They stood close shoulder to shoulder, heads low, bodies forming single living mass. Heat gathered between them, slow and steady. Elias walked the line once more, pressing hand against the grass-backed sections, checking for loose movement. He listened, not to the wind itself, but to how it changed as it passed the shelter. Lower sound meant slower air. Slower air meant
It
survival.
does
He
not
stepped
need
back and
to.
watched. In the open ground
Weight
beyond, the
needs
wind
to produce
scoured the
the
earth
heat.
clean. Snow skittered and lifted, never settling. But behind the curved wall, flakes dropped straight down, piling softly at the horses instead of driving into their coats. That was all he needed. No fire, no roof, no walls thick enough to trap breath. And just a shake that told the storm where it was no longer welcome. Elias turned away at last, satisfied, not because the shelter was strong, but because it was correct. In the Rockies, correctness mattered more than strength, and as the wind pressed harder against the curve he had built, it broke itself apart piece by piece until all that reached the horses was silence and time. Why dry hooves matter more than warm air. With the wind broken, Elias Crowe turned his attention downward. Most men looked at a shelter and thought in terms of walls and roofs. Elias thought in terms of contact. What touched the body longest took the most heat, and for a horse standing through a winter night, nothing touched longer than the ground beneath its hooves and belly. Cold air could be endured, cold earth could not. Elias knelt and pressed his palm against inside the shelter. It was already stiffening as the temperature fell. By morning, it would be iron hard, pulling warmth out of anything that stood on it for too long. A horse lost heat through its legs faster than through its back, long bones, little muscle, constant contact. Once the legs chilled, circulation slowed. Once circulation slowed, the animal stopped shifting its weight. And once a horse stopped shifting, it stood in one place until the cold finished its work. Elias rose and moved quickly now, though still without panic. He hauled in bundles of dry prairie grass and shook them loose with practiced motions. The grass fell in thick, uneven layers, trapping air the same way a winter coat did. He worked especially hard along the inner curve of the shelter, where the horses would stand longest. He added old straw where he had it, pine needles where he did not. Perfection was unnecessary. Coverage was everything. The difference was immediate. Where bare ground had felt sharp and draining, the layered floor gave slightly underfoot. It stayed dry. It breathed moisture from hooves wicked upward instead of pulling beneath them. Elias watched as one of the horses shifted its stance, testing the footing. The animal lowered its head and exhaled, then relaxed. Another followed suit. Small signs, easily missed by someone who did not know what to look for. Dry footing meant confidence. Confidence meant movement. Movement meant warmth. He paid special attention to the edges of the shelter, where snow might drift in and melt under body heat. There he built the bedding deeper, creating a raised, insulated lip that kept moisture from creeping inward. Water always sought the lowest place. Elias made sure that place was nowhere the horses would stand. Men who failed to understand winter thought he was lost upward into the night sky. Elias knew better. He fled downward into the ground where it could not be reclaimed. A horse standing on wet, frozen soil lost warmth even if the air was calm. A horse standing on dry bedding could endure wind that would freeze a man solid. Elias stepped into the shelter himself, standing where the horses stood, the difference pressed up through his boots. Subtle but undeniable. Cold no longer reached straight into his bones. He nodded once. This was how winter was beaten. Not with fire and force, but with layers, dryness, and attention to the smallest details, the kind of details that decided whether horse would still be standing come morning. Outside the shelter, the wind rose again, rattling branches and carrying snow across the open ground. Inside, the horses stood steady, shifting occasionally, hooves dry, bodies close. Elias moved among them quietly, spreading the last of the grass where it thinned, then stepped back to watch. The ground had been addressed. And in winter, that meant the first real victory had already been won. How Elias used biology to build warmth from within as night settled fully over the mountains. Elias Crowe turned to the last task that mattered before the coldest hours arrived. He did not reach for firewood. Fire was unreliable. It burned bright, demanded constant attention, and gave back less heat than it consumed in effort. Elias had learned long ago that flame was comfort, not security, especially for horses. Instead, he went to the feet. From sack stiff with frost, Elias pulled long stem hay, dry, coarse, and fibrous, not grain, never grain on night like this. Grain burned too fast inside horse, spiking energy and leaving nothing behind when the cold settled deepest. What he wanted tonight was slow heat. He spread the hay thickly along the inner curve of the shelter more than he would on an ordinary winter night. This was no time to be careful with rations. Cold consumed energy relentlessly. Horse that ran shore would burn its own strength to stay warm. That strength, once lost in winter, was hard to replace. The horses lowered their heads and began to chew. Elias watched closely, arms folded inside his coat, listening to the steady rhythm of jaws working fiber into warmth. This sound meant more to him than the crackle of any fire. Chewing, slower breathing conserved energy, and deep inside each animal, something far more reliable. Flame was beginning to work. The horse's gut was furnace. Elias did not know the word fermentation, but he understood the process. Rough forage broke down slowly in the great chamber of the gut, releasing heat hour after hour as bacteria did their work. That heat spread outward through muscle and blood, warming the animal from the inside where wind could not reach it. A fire outside could be blown away. This fire could not. Steam rose faintly from the horses' nostrils as they ate, breath steady, bodies relaxing. Elias nodded once. These signs mattered. Calm horse wasted less energy. Busy gut meant warmth would last through the darkest stretch before dawn. He checked the feet carefully as he worked, discarding any damp. Frozen strands, moisture stole heat instead of creating it. Elias had seen horses weaken not from cold alone, but from feet that worked against them. Winter punished carelessness quickly. Once, years earlier, he had tried to warm horses with large fire built nearby. The flames had danced and snapped in the wind, offering comfort for a short while. By midnight, the fire had burned low. By morning, the horses had stood cold and restless, their bodies robbed of heat. Soon as the flames died, tonight was different. Elias returned near midnight with one final armful of hay, spreading it evenly. He timed it carefully. Digestion peaked hours later. Exactly when the cold reached deepest and men were most tempted to panic, he stepped back and let the horses work. No shouting, no rushing, no firelight flickering against wet coats, just steady chewing, shared warmth, and biological fire burning where winter could not touch it. As Elias moved to the edge of the shelter and watched snow drift beyond the windbreak, he felt the quiet confidence that only experience could give. The night would still be long, the cold would still be bitter, but inside the horses, warmth was being made, slowly, steadily, and without flame. And that was the kind of heat that lasted. White lights didn't brush the horses clean the first snow ride without ceremony. It did not fall thick or heavy. It drifted in quietly, carried sideways by the wind, settling on manes and backs in fine, powdery layer, the kind of snow that looked harmless, almost gentle. If you didn't understand it, Elias Crowe understood it well enough to leave it alone. Younger man would have moved quickly among the horses, brushing their coats clean, shaking snow from their backs as if tidiness were protection. Elias watched instead. He waited to see how the snow behaved. Dry snow sat lightly atop the horses' winter coats, never reaching the skin. It clung to the outer hairs, creating soft white layer that trapped air the same way for it did. Beneath it, the coat remained warm and dry. Snow, Elias knew, was not always the enemy. Sometimes it was covered. He reached out and pressed his gloved hand against the flank of the nearest horse. Snow and all, the warmth beneath surprised even him. The heat had nowhere to go. The snow above, cold as it was, slowed the loss. Nature had added layer Elias hadn't needed to build. He stepped back and let it work. Only when the snow changed would he intervene. Wet snow was different. Snow that melted against warm hair collapsed the cold structure and crept inward. Freezing rain was worse still. Slick, heavy, relentless, those conditions demanded action. But this snow was dry. It whispered when it fell. It stayed light. Elias watched the horses carefully for signs of discomfort. None stamped or shook. None shifted nervously. They stood with backs rounded slightly, heads low, breathing slow, and steady content. The windbreak did its work. The ground beneath their hooves stayed dry. Their bodies supplied the rest. Men who fought winter at every turn exhausted themselves. They burned wood too fast, worked too hard, made problems where none existed. Elias had learned to ask a different question. Not how do I remove this, but what is it doing? Snow that insulated was allowed to stay. Snow that soaked was brushed away. Snow that piled too deep was cleared before it could trap legs or collapse footing. Control did not mean constant action. It meant correct action. Elias glanced upward as flakes continued to settle, faint against the dark sky. Tomorrow the ground beyond the shelter would be scoured clean by wind, but here, behind the curve, snow fell straight down and stayed where it landed. That too. Useful. Snow built up slowly along the outer edge of the shelter, thickening the barrier without effort or materials. The storm itself was reinforcing what Elias had built. He did nothing to stop it. In the mountains, survival favored the man who could tell the difference between danger and advantage, especially when they looked the same at first glance. Elias pulled his coat tighter and stood still, letting the snow settle where it chose. For now, winter was offering help and was wise enough to accept it. While Elias never separated his horses as the night deepened, Elias Crowe resisted the urge to move the horses again. Men who did not understand animals believed constant action meant care. They pushed, pulled, rearranged, convinced that control required motion. Elias had learned the opposite. In winter, unnecessary movement cost more than it saved. He watched the herd from the edge of the shelter, eyes adjusting to the dark, listening more than looking. The horses arranged themselves without instruction, shoulders pressed close, flanks aligned. Larger bodies took the outer positions. Smaller ones stood near the center. No rope dictated this order. Instinct did. Together they formed something no structure could replace. Living barrier of muscle breath and shared warmth. Single horse left alone in winter burned energy fast. Its breathing quickened, its muscles tense, anxiety took hold. Fear made the body waste heat, and wasted heat could not be replaced. Elias had seen solitary horses fail even under good shelter. They paced, they stamped, they burned themselves out trying to stay warm. The herd, different. Ear movement was minimal but constant. One horse shifted, another adjusted. Heat flowed between bodies, slow and steady. Wind that slipped past the shelter met wall of living mass instead of single exposed flame. The horses did not need encouragement. They did not need force. They needed proximity. Elias remembered men who insisted on tying horses apart to prevent kicking or jostling. Those men often found themselves bearing animals come morning. Separation invited weakness. Weakness invited collapse. He rested, hand lightly against the neck of the nearest horse, feeling the warmth through the thick coat. The animal flicked ear but did not move away. Trust was built through consistency. and consistency mattered most when conditions turned hostile. The herd's calm spread outward. The wind howled beyond the shelter, but inside the curved space sound dulled. Snow drifted down in slow, deliberate flakes. Breath rose and faded in soft rhythm. Elias stood with them for a long moment, sharing the stillness. This was not sentiment. It was understanding. Survival in the mountains never been about strength alone. It was about alignment of bodies, of movement, of purpose. Horses survived winter the same way men once had, together close enough to borrow warmth, steady enough to keep fear from taking hold. Elias stepped back at last, satisfied. He would not break the herd unless forced to. He would not scatter what nature had taught to gather. When morning came, and it'll come, even after the longest night, the horses would still be standing, not because they had been protected one by one, but because they had endured as one. What the blizzard left behind the storm passed the way it had arrived without announcement. Sometime before dawn, the wind loosened its grip, the hard edge in the air softened. Snow that had driven sideways through the night began to fall straight down, then not at all. Silence returned to the mountains deeper than before. Elias Crowe was awake when it happened. He always was. Winter taught men to sleep lightly. He stepped into the shelter as the first gray light crept over the bridge. The horses were still standing just as he had left them. Steam rose from their backs in the cold air, slow and even. No frantic movement. No signs of collapse. Alive. But survival did not end when the wind stopped. Elias moved among them methodically. He checked hooves first, clearing packed snow and ice before it could harden. Frozen hoof led to stiffness. Stiffness led to injury. Injury in winter became death sentence. He ran his hands along their legs, feeling for unnatural cold, for swelling, for the tremor that came before weakness. Where coats were damp, he brushed them dry with handfuls of straw, careful not to strip away the insulating layer beneath. The ground beneath the shelter had held. The bedding was compressed but dry. That mattered more than anything else. One by one, Elias led the horses short distance into the open, just enough. Encouraged movement. Slow steps, no strain. Blood needed to flow again. Muscles needed to remember motion. He increased their feed that morning, not with grain, but with more coarse hay. Digestion would generate warmth through the long, cold day ahead. The storm might be gone, but winter remained. As the sun climbed, Elias stood apart and watched the horses graze where snow had been scoured away by wind. He let himself breathe fully for the first time in hours. Not every winter had ended this way. There had been seasons when he stood alone beside, a stiff body half buried in drifted snow, knowing exactly what mistake had been made, and knowing it was too late to undo it. No book had taught him what he knew now, no teacher but loss. Every technique he used, the windbreak, the bedding, the feeding, the decision to leave snow undisturbed, had been paid for in memory. Frontier knowledge did not arrive in clean lessons. It arrived broken, learned too late, then carried forward by those who survived long enough to remember. Elias looked out across the quiet land, the shelter still standing behind him, reinforced now by a low wall of snow the storm itself had built. He would dismantle it later, reuse materials, store what remained. Nothing was permanent out here. Nothing needed to be. What mattered was that the horses lived, because as long as they lived, so did he. That was the truth the mountains taught again and again to anyone willing to listen. Winter did not care about courage. It did not respect effort. It only acknowledged understanding. And that morning, standing among 6 living animals in land that killed carelessly, Elias Crowe knew he had understood enough. For